So how am I going to put all these parts together to build a solid open diff rear axle for the Zuul Runner build? And is it even going to work? We're going to find out in this next episode of the Zuul Runner Build Series. So let's get started. Okay, so let's go over the parts that are going to be involved in making this rear axle. First thing we have here is I have a MT12 rear pumpkin, and then I have an Element Enduro rear axle, an MT12 differential set, a B74 differential set, and an input pinion from a B74. So we're going to set that aside for now. The reason why I have these two differential sets is because we are going to use the internal gears from the MT12 and put them into the B74 differential. And you're probably wondering why we're doing that. And that's because we are going to be using the inner axles from an Enduro, and the way that they mate with the gears is they have these two little flat spots on either side. That mates with the spool on an Enduro axle, but we're not using an Enduro axle or an Enduro spool. We're using a differential. We want an open differential. It just so happens that the sun gear on an MT12 mates with the axle just fine, just perfectly. It's the same dimensions. So that's going to work for that. The downside is because the B74 uses outdrives, this differential is no longer going to be 100% sealed, so we won't be able to use fluid. We'll have to use grease instead. It's not ideal, but it works. So I'm going to go ahead. The first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and assemble the differentials for this, and then we'll get to how we're going to put these two together to make a single axle. That's going to be the interesting part, and we'll get to that soon. Okay, so there are the parts for this diff. And like I said before, you can see how the B74 uses an outdrive that mates with the internal sun gear. We can't use this. This isn't going to work with our setup. So I'm going to have to use the sun gear from an MT12, and that's going to fit right onto the inner axle from the Enduro. And you can see that's a perfect fit. So let's go ahead and assemble this diff. All right, so there we go. Get the diff assembled. Everything is pretty much just from the B74 with the exception of the sun gears. We use the sun gears from the MT12. Everything else from the MT12 diff can be used for something else. We don't need the O-rings or the pins from the B74. And we're just left with a differential, a B74 differential that now accepts the internal axles from a Element Enduro. It's just a matter of getting everything lined up. There you go. Now we have a differential that it's going to work inside the axle once we get the axle put together. So let's start doing that. Okay, so how are we going to make these two axles into one axle, and why? We want the dimensions and the geometry of the Enduro axle, but we want the pumpkin from an MT12. The reason why is because the B74 differential does not fit inside the Enduro axle. There's no way that's going to fit. But the MT12 axle is much bigger, so this will fit together. The only thing is we'll need to Dremel at the top and the bottom of the MT12 pumpkin because it hits on the ring gear. This ring gear is just a little bit too big. But just getting a Dremel, just Dremeling that out, and it slides right in. I'll also need to cut off these tubes off of the MT12 axle, and we'll need to cut off the axle tubes as close as we can to this pumpkin on the Enduro because we're going to put these axle tubes onto here. I've already done that to this pumpkin. This was from the Ecto build, the 2-wheel drive version. As you can see, this one hasn't been Dremeled on the inside. As you can see, it fits in there, but it's just tight. We need to Dremel out the top and the bottom here. And then a little bit of the area around the inside of the housing here around the input pinion, that also needs to be Dremeled just a little bit. Just enough just to clear the ring gear or the input pinion, because this input pinion is much bigger than what would be on the MT12. So we got a lot of machining to do. And the first thing to do is to remove these tubes. So now I have the axle tubes from the Enduro axle cut off and cleaned up. And I have the MT12 axle, also cut off the little tubes off the end here, bored out the hole to fit these axle tubes in. So those will fit inside here. This one goes on this side. And this one goes on this side. I will have a completed axle. And let's get to dremeling. You can see here where I removed some of the material right along here, all the way around. It's just a little bit, just enough to clear the ring gear. It drops right in. It looks like it needs a little bit more. Oh, looks about good. Just needs a little bit more cleaning up. So there we go. The inside's all been dremeled. And I have installed a few shims on the differential. And then the RC Speed Secrets bearings. And I've installed a few shims on the input pinion as well. Then the bearing goes in there. And then just drop in the pinion in there and the differential, the outer input bearing, and there you go. The differential is now installed and everything clears. Nice and clean. Now we need to glue on the axle tubes. Okay, everything's installed in the new axle. Everything is lined up, rotates freely. Now all we need to do is glue it together using some of the JB Weld plastic bonder. I have these trays set up here so that I can line everything up, make sure everything is nice and flat. And then we'll be done. Well, almost. We'll almost be done. And as you can tell, I mix a lot of epoxy in this cup. If you're wondering, Yes, I did put some of this on the inside as well. I just forgot to hit the record button when I was doing that. So you get the second part. You see a little bit of it there. The nice thing about this glue, this plastic weld stuff, is it matches the color of the axles. So once it's all dry, we'll barely even notice it's there. Alrighty, let's set that up. Take off the differ. Just set that up and wait for it to dry. To add a little bit more strength to this, what I'm going to do is I have these two small screws, and I am going to drill a hole here and a hole here, and then thread those in, and that'll help hold it as well, give it a little bit more extra strength. And then once the whole thing is done, I'm also going to put this truss brace. That's going to bolt on over here like this, and that's going to add even more strength. This axle is going to be perfectly fine. It's not going to go anywhere. The one on my Ecto runner, I've been running that hard and fast, and it hasn't failed me yet. So I think this will be just fine. Okay, so there we go. I got a completed axle. The only problem with this, though, is that on the MT12 pumpkins, the upper link mount is lower and forward when it's compared to the Enduro axle. You can see that compared to the two. We want to try to keep the upper link mount at the same height as the Element Enduro axle. And so to do that, I had to design and print up a link mount adapter. I designed this in Tinkercad and then sent it off to get printed at CraftCloud. CraftCloud's a great website if you don't have access to a 3D printer. They have a lot of different materials, good pricing, fast shipping. That's a good place to go. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but I do highly recommend them if you ever need to get something 3D printed. So the way this is going to mount is it's going to slide right over on top of the upper link mounts here on the MT12 axle. It's molded perfectly to fit on top of the MT12 axle or pumpkin. It just slides down like that. It's a tight fit, but that's good because once it's on, we don't need to necessarily remove it. There we go. So it fits on there like that. So now all I need to do is install some screws, and that'll be firmly in place. Then it'll come to mounting the truss brace. That'll mount right into the back of that. I'll have to add some spacers, but it'll all be good. Now for added security and strength, I'm going to drill a single hole here in the middle that's going to go through the truss brace and into the upper link mount. All right, now we got that rear axle all finished. We got to bolt it and the rear suspension to the chassis rails. Then we got to bolt these chassis rails to the B74 chassis. Put it together like that. It's coming together. Loving this. It's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting. So if you want to watch this project get finished, make sure you like, subscribe, turn that notification bell on. It's going to be awesome. It's exciting. Can't wait for it to be finished. See you next time.